In an earlier conversation in this series, Evan Thomas discussed his 1986 book, The Wise Men. There were 6 of them: Messrs. Acheson, Bohlen, Harriman, McCloy, Lovett, and Kennan. Now, in this episode, we asked Edward Ted Aldrich to discuss his book titled The Partnership: George Marshall, Henry Stimson, and the Extraordinary Collaboration That Won World War II. Mr. Aldrich writes, FDR paired Stimson as Secretary of War with General George Marshall, Chief of Staff of the Army, in the summer of 1940 in anticipation of the global war into which all these men knew the United States could shortly be drawn. Ted Aldrich, you tell us that you're not a historian, you're not an author, you're not a writer, but I've been spending the last week with your book. How'd that happen?
Well, I've been a history buff since literally 8 years old when I walked into my classroom, second grade classroom, and there were portraits of the presidents on the wall. And after a few weeks of bothering my teacher with questions about them, she gave me a biography of Andrew Jackson. I was fascinated with it, and honestly, I've been reading it ever since. Being a commuter from Connecticut to New York City for many, many years allowed me to indulge in the passion of reading. And I read a bunch of books, like a lot of people. I got into World War II phases, became really enamored with Marshall at one point. And then later on, I got in a Cold War phase and became enamored with Stimson, thinking both guys were really underappreciated. I knew enough about history to know they had to have some kind of a close working relationship. I assumed someone wrote about it. When I couldn't find anything, I thought, here I'm on this train for nearly 3 hours a day. I might have time to do this. So I managed to get Stimson's 10,000-page diary, 4,000 pages of which he kept during the war. And he really chronicled every conversation he had with Marshall, and got it on my laptop and spent 7 years researching and writing. And I couldn't believe that a publisher thought it was worth publishing, because I did it more, even if I never got it published, it was really fun to have a deep dive. But I was, of course, thrilled to have it published.
Where did you grow up?
Rowayton, Connecticut.
What's that like? What kind of a community?
Small. It's part of a larger town called Norwalk, Connecticut, of 80,000 people, which is in Fairfield County, but more of the working class part of Fairfield County. But Rowayton's a village within that, 4,000 people surrounded on water by 3 sides, and very nice place to grow up.
What were your parents like?
My father was a football player at Princeton University and chemical engineer major. Became an inventor, later a banker. My mother comes from New England stock. She's related to Hannibal Hamlin, who's a trivia question for most people, probably not yourself, but he was the Lincoln's vice president during his first 4 years from Maine. So there's always been a lot of family history that we talk about from that side. And I had 3 other brothers and sisters. And my parents were very much believed. They always had a dictionary by the dining room table, and Sunday night dinners were full of debates about current topics. And I always tried to throw in debates about history with a little less interest from them.
Go back to when you're 8 years old. What was the next step in your interest in history? How did you continue it?
So I took AP courses in high school. I went to college fully intended to major in history. And after my freshman year, I went up to the dean of history at Colgate University and said, I'd like to make a living being a historian. And he said, why would you want to do that? And he proceeded to tell me his life story. And he said, here's what's going to happen. You're going to have bored students. You're going to force you to publish. You'll probably fall in love with someone from the academic world. You'll initially, God forbid, a university hire the both of you. So you'll be working at Dartmouth. She'll be working at Duke. You'll get together once a week initially, and then it's going to be slipped to every couple of weeks, then a month. He went on, and he said, "You really love history?" I said, "Yes." He said, "Just read it on your own time." So I walked over to the economics department after that. And you know what? He wasn't wrong. I've had plenty of time to really enjoy history and reading books. So I think it wasn't bad advice. That being said, the academic world is always something that would have interested me for sure.
So you are involved in money and commodities. Explain what your job actually is.
Yeah, I work for a bank. I started working for Union Bank of Switzerland. Spent a couple years in Switzerland, 3 years in England, and basically I finance physical commodity traders, people that trade in all kinds of metals, agricultural items, and energy items. And it's one of the things that really helped me with this book, because the efforts of Stimson and Marshall were so much geared towards logistics, moving things from one place to the other, particularly during tough conditions. And most of the conversations I've had with the CEOs of the companies that have financed, I typically always ask them, what keeps you up at night? And it was always, let's just say it was a coffee trader. He had to go find the coffee in Africa or Colombia, figure out a way to get it from the forest to the port, where to store it at the port, where to, how to ship it to where the coffee was needed, where to store it there, how to distribute it. And I always laughed at myself when I was reading Stimson's diary that these guys had all those problems just on a scale that was unimaginable, particularly during wartime conditions. It's one thing to get a ship, during peace, but, when you have to divert it into places that are safe. So it did really help me understand and appreciate their efforts, which I say in the book, I think were the greatest feat of their efforts were the greatest feat of management in the history of the world. And what they did to, procure the weapons and supplies and men and train them and then move them around the world to 4 or 5 different continents where they were needed at the right time. It was remarkable. And these guys really were the ones that were in charge of it from the standpoint of the Army and Air Force. Of course, the Navy was handled by a different department.
The book's been out a couple of years, 2022. What has happened during these 2 years since the book's been out that you didn't expect?
It's a really great question. I've given about 50 talks and no one's asked me that. Well, here's one thing. Being a banker and not a historian and not really paying attention. If someone asked me 5 years ago, how many books do you think you'll sell if it gets published? I would have guessed. I would have just thrown out modestly 200,000, 250,000. And I had no idea that's Harry Potter type of territory. So I think the big surprise was that it has sold so little. But a lot of my historians, friends and mentors who I've gotten in touch with over the last 10 years, people like Evan Thomas, have told me, yeah, I don't know what you were thinking. People don't buy books anymore, particularly long ones. So it has been a bit of a struggle to keep that alive, and that's why I keep talking. And again, I think the thing that drives me mainly is I just have a thing for people that are underrated or underappreciated. I think Marshall ranks right up there in the top 3 Americans with Washington and Lincoln, and Stimson's not that far behind. And I want their story told, because when it comes to World War II, everyone reads about Eisenhower and Patton and MacArthur and Nimitz and these great soldiers, and they deserve all the books that have been written about them. But nobody ever writes a book about guys who are sitting in Washington, D.C. And, proof of that is very few people know who the Secretary of War was during World War I. Newton Baker, or the Civil War. Edwin Stanton, people know a little more about him. And the Army Chief of Staff, some guy named Peyton March in World War I, an unknown name, and Henry Halleck in the Civil War. So these guys deserve the recognition. Marshall, of course, is famous for the Marshall Plan, but that happened after the war. And what he did during the war was remarkable. So
let's, for a minute, think that you're back in the time of Stimson and Marshall. And as you point out, from time to time, they had offices next to each other and the door was always open. If you went into Henry Stimson's office and sat down and talked to him, describe what he would be like.
He had no sense of humor. Neither of them did. So he's very serious. He would have said, "What do you want?" and I would have had to be fairly quick. He had proper manners. He was well educated, as you know, Phillips of Andover, Yale, Harvard Law School. So he was versed in all the manners that his socioeconomic class in that era had. But he was a very serious guy, deep thinker, and he would have been interested if I had something to offer him, something that could. He was all about educating himself, and there are a lot of people like that. I think the difference between him was he retained it all. It's something that I know my own limits. If I read a book on James Buchanan and someone asks me 5 years later, what can you tell me about James Buchanan? I'd say who? Whereas anything Stimson ever took in, he kept. For example, at one point, one of the presidents, probably Coolidge or Harding, put him in charge of a study just of coal, international coal, to make sure the U.S. had secure supplies. And he spent 6 months on doing, and he threw himself into it because he was such a serious guy. When it came to the war, he had all that here because he had that type of mind. It was a slow mind, like people who worked for him, like Felix Frankfurter, who he hired in 1906 to work for him at the U.S. Attorney of the Southern District of New York. Frankfurter, they would laugh because there were two things. One, it took him a while to get certain things, but when he did, he knew it better than anyone. And the other thing was he had trouble focusing on a lot of things at the same time. He liked to focus on one issue and throw everything into it. Long story is, in Washington Stimson's office, it would have been very serious. And Marshall, no different at all. They were very similar in that fashion. Now, outside of war, maybe they would have had a little more time for other discussions. But they were, Stimson's diary revealed that, these guys are working on 20 or 30 things on a single day. Here's an example. I was reading on my train ride. I wrote most of the book and researched it on the train to New York, as I told you earlier. I'm reading one day the diary, and Stimson is going through all these hugely important things. And then he says at the end, and another thing, I decided today to build the Pentagon. I think it's going to be a good thing. One sentence devoted to the building of what today is still the largest office building in the world, but it was the least important thing he was deciding on that day. So it just gave me a sense that these guys were very serious. They put everything into it. They left nothing on the table during the workday, and they were exhausted at the end of the night. They're both guys who believed in 8 hours of sleep, believed in rest, exercise. They treated their bodies like they were machines, and they took care of them because they knew they were making decisions that were going to impact the world.
Do the same thing with George Marshall. You're in his office. He's there sitting behind his desk. What do you think it would have been like?
It would have been really intimidating. Churchill famously feared only one person, and that was George Marshall. His integrity was such that integrity in a democracy is a really powerful thing. And someone like Churchill was just intimidated by him, as I would have been walking into his office. Again, I wouldn't have walked in unless I had something important to tell him. And then it would have been all business, and he would have, as Eisenhower and Bradley pointed out, when he agreed with something, he just kind of grunted, and you were on your way. He was never informal. No one ever called him George. Franklin Roosevelt made the mistake once during a meeting, and Marshall gave him a death stare, and Roosevelt never called him George again, only General.
In your book, you, of course, tell us everything you can about both men, but very quickly, Stimson worked for 5 different presidencies, you tell us. He worked for William Howard Taft, FDR, both as Secretary of War, 27 years apart. He worked for Hoover as a Secretary of State. He was a Governor General of the Philippines for Calvin Coolidge, and U.S. Attorney in the Southern District of New York, that everybody hears about today, every day practically, under Theodore Roosevelt. Why did both parties, why did they all see him as capable of doing all those different jobs?
Well, let's go chronologically, and I'll keep it short. The first person that offered him a public job was Teddy Roosevelt. Teddy Roosevelt got to know him through one of the outdoors clubs, Boone and Crockett Club or something, and they became friends. They were somewhat in the same circle. They're only 9 years apart, which is remarkable. And he was a protege of Elihu Root, who was a well-known statesman who worked for William McKinley as Secretary of State and Teddy Roosevelt as Secretary of War, I think, or the other way around. So he, during an era when monopolies were the thing that Roosevelt was going to go after, he put Stimson in charge of the attorney's office in New York, and he did a wonderful job. So the first job, he set himself up by really crushing the assignment and establishing himself as a guy who really knew what to do. Taft gave him the Secretary of War position. And what is interesting is, I guess in answer to your question, there are a few reasons. One, competence and integrity, absolutely bipartisan. And there was also a belief that he didn't have an agenda. So it was one of the reasons Franklin Roosevelt hired him. He was a lousy campaigner, so people knew he wasn't going to run for anything. He tried to run for governor once. Teddy Roosevelt made him, and he was just terrible. So it's a combination of those things: competence, his connections, his reputation, and the fact that they thought that he wasn't going to do anything against their interest because he had no political agenda of his own.
What's your take on the fact that William Howard Taft had him as his Secretary of War, and the second time around, William Howard Taft's son, as you point out in your book, Robert Taft, a Republican, a conservative from Ohio, gave him a hard time, and he didn't win unanimous votes from the Senate. As a matter of fact, it was 4-3, as you point out, coming out of the committee.
So Taft was a big leader of the isolationists, and Stimson was to America what Churchill was to England during the years up to the start of World War II, in that anytime he could, either on the radio or in the New York Times editorial, would say, hey, listen, this guy Hitler, he's bad news. This is not going to end up well. We need to do something about it. So he was a hardcore interventionist. Taft's son, Robert, great senator, was a diehard isolationist, and he put aside any feelings of friendship that his father may have had with, or Stimson may have had with his father, to absolutely grill him on the stand, because he had ambitions to be a leader of that party and to be president, and he had to stick it to Stimson because Stimson was the most famous interventionist in the country.
I'll come back to George Marshall in a second. I want to ask you about the routine of the train into the city. For those who have never seen this routine up and down the coast, explain how it works and what it was like sitting in this train with your computer. Well,
I started by, over the years, I have a library of books, about 700 books. So I had a lot of the materials. And then I had, as I said, the diary on the laptop. So I would, because I don't plan on selling the books, I always tell my kids jokingly, someday all this will be yours. And they laugh because it's just history books. But I'd mark them up. And after 2 or 3 years of marking it up, I would take a book or two each day under the train. And I didn't even have an outline. The key thing was to get an aisle or a window seat. If I got a middle seat, really difficult because you need the elbows to type. So I would look through the books and turn, where I had dog-eared them, note the remarks, and then put it in a part of the book, initially a blank page, where I thought it might go. And eventually, over the years, I started to have the outline of a book and chapters and things like that, always keeping the diary up to date and double-checking on it and going through chronologically. And the great thing about it, and I had a few authors who would tell me they were envious of me because I'd never had a deadline. So many authors, they give a proposal to a publisher, and the publisher says, all right, I want to see 100 pages by this date. I want to see, final version. Some couldn't believe it, that I didn't care when I finished. So there was a certain luxury about that. I would do it on planes and train, and I never worked on it at home because I actually got quite used to writing on the train and that style. Someone probably who did a proper outline could have done a far better job on this book, but I think it reads pretty well because I think I covered the important aspects. I really wanted the background because I felt to understand the relationship, you had to understand their relevant backgrounds. In my initial many of the publishers said, just get to the war. And I refused to do that because I felt you can't understand how they work together until you see the different paths to there. Then I really wanted to cover the 17 months before Pearl Harbor, because that's when they had the real challenge of trying to build the country's arsenal up in an era where 85% of the people were isolationists. So if they were too successful, Roosevelt would have been not reelected in 1940. And if they were too slow, they would have been unprepared. So it was this remarkable balance. And then the rest, of course, is the war.
What's your take on, and I get the impression from reading the book that you felt that they kind of knew the Japanese were going to attack somewhere at some point. How much of that was held off by Roosevelt because he wanted to get reelected?
I don't think that there was any. I mean, the question I usually get on that is, did they know that it was going to be Pearl Harbor? And my take on that is they knew that there was going to be an attack on December 7th, but Pearl Harbor, they did not think it was going to be there. 3 or 4 years earlier, they did. And the Japanese, I worked for the Japanese for 11 years for one of the big Japanese banks. And I can tell you, they're master planners. And they decided to have this 3-year plan to fool the world into thinking that their attack was going to be in the Far East. Because Pearl Harbor originally was 1 or 2 on the list. And they successfully did that. And it was a big mistake. Marshall was fooled by them. And nobody appreciated that you could take airplanes on a ship undetected and bomb. The air power was just not something anyone had an appreciation for. So they knew when it was going to be done, not where. I don't think Roosevelt hid that type of thing. The only thing Roosevelt hid was he was an interventionist in his heart, but publicly he was a political animal, as you know, and he wanted to stay in power, and he could not. The best he could do was bring someone like Stimson in and Frank Knox for the Navy Department, who were interventionists, take the heat from making those appointments, and then kind of walk along that wire, balancing the needs of preparing the nation versus staying in power. He did a great job.
When was the first time you decided to dig into this? I know I've seen the year 2011, but before that, what was the lead up to where you were on your way to doing this book?
Yeah, it's. I think I mentioned earlier. I couldn't believe after reading a biography of Marshall how that there wasn't a monument in Washington to him. I mean, it blew me away. Very similar to when I read Cherno's book on Lafayette. It just was remarkable how underappreciated even he is. Never occurred to me that I'd be writing a book, that my future had writing a book.
Did you mean Cherno's book on Hamilton?
On Hamilton, sorry.
Yeah.
Yes.
You said Lafayette. I just wanted to make sure.
I meant Hamilton.
Okay.
Did he write? Yeah. And then later on, as I mentioned, I read a book about Elihu Root, and then I read a book about Stimson, and I thought, wow, this guy too. And then I wanted to read a book on both of them, and that's when I mentioned I went to Amazon and searched for a book on Stimson. Marshall, went to the internet. I found one guy had written a 3-page paper on it, and I thought their partnership needs to be brought out there. And I thought maybe I could do it. And so in 2011, my father and I, my father being a chemical engineer and being a really intellectual guy, we went down to Yale University together and started looking through the microfilm. And I assigned him to study the atomic bomb and that whole process because he understands the science of it. The big challenge was Yale only had microfilm. And I went up to them and I said, have you ever thought about digitizing these? Because I had a job. I couldn't go to Yale University. And the woman was very cagey. And I'm like, look, I'll pay for it. I'll write a check for you right now if you digitize it. But it was clear to me that they kind of wanted historians to come to New Haven and come to the library. I was very frustrated. I didn't think I could do the book. And as I was leaving, this Yale student who worked at the library kind of went, hey, as if he were selling me drugs. And I walked to the corner. I'm like, what? He said, and he whispered in my ear, he said, listen, you can buy the microfilm and then have it converted to digital somewhere else. Don't say I said anything. He gave me some address. I bought all 10 reels of the microfilm, sent it to some company in Minnesota. They sent back a thumb drive. And I was very grateful to that kid because I might have given up the project at that point. That was all around 2011.
I have to tell you, as a personal aside, because it fits in this story. When I first came to Washington in 1966, I lived in a one-room apartment on the second floor in Arlington, Virginia. And every day when I would go down to the 7-Eleven on the first floor, there was this unassuming man walking around. I had no idea. He had no sense of humor. I didn't have any conversation with him. I didn't give it any more thought. I had no idea who he was. The end of the story, I saw a photograph of him years later. It was Forrest Pogue.
Wow.
My question to you, though, is I wish I'd have known it at the time. Who is Forrest Pogue and what role did he play in your book?
So Forrest Pogue is to George Marshall as Robert Caro is to Lyndon Johnson. Caro, as you know, has spent the last 50 years writing about Johnson's and is just about to publish his 5th volume. Forrest Pogue spent, I think he was a guy in the Army. He spent 40 years writing a 4-volume book on Marshall. If I didn't have a job, the proper way to write one of these books is to go down. I would have had to spend time at Yale, go down to Lexington, Virginia, where Marshall's papers are, and rent an apartment there for several months. But you do that because you just hope to find that one letter that Marshall might have written his cousin saying, I really don't care for Henry Stimson at all, or something like that. That would be interesting in a book. But because Forrest Pogue, he interviewed 300 plus people for the book, all people that worked with Marshall. He went through all Marshall's papers. He spent 40 years doing it. I didn't feel like I needed to reinvent the wheel. I couldn't, even if I wanted to. So I relied heavily on him, and he did a remarkable job. He also did all these interviews with people that he had on tape that I purchased that could be considered, direct primary material. And he also spent 40 hours interviewing Marshall. So where I'm sitting now, one of the really fun parts of this book, aside from reading Stimson's diary, was just listening to these interviews from Marshall. And he was old, and he did, I'm a rookie historian, and I did make one mistake, and then the second printing, I'll clear it up. During the interviews, he was talking about the secrecy of the atomic bomb. And he said that Admiral Leahy didn't know about it till, quote, the last minute. And because Marshall is who Marshall is, this man of rock integrity, I put that in the book. Turns out I should have questioned it because Leahy was like one of the 4 Joint Chiefs of Staff. He was Roosevelt's guy. Of course he was going to know about it. I have found since he did know about it. So that was Marshall in later years. Just his memory was slipping a little. But so that's Forrest Pogue, remarkable guy, 40 years writing about the life of George Marshall.
How did you find a publisher? What was your path?
So a few things. One, everyone said, you got to get an agent. I said, no, I'm going to finish the book first. My goal was to finish the book, a complete manuscript. And it ended up, I got a little carried away on the train, and it ended up being 800 pages. And a few people, again, like Evan Thomas, said, listen, you're going to have to cut that. Nobody's reading 800-page books anymore. So I approached, I managed to, when I finished, I got an agent who happened to be a well-known person who was related to my nephew. My nephew was dating her grandniece. Her name's Esther Newberg. And she gave it to the top 5 publishing houses. And I wasn't even aware there were top 5 publishing houses. And those are the ones you want to get because they get reviews for the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal. I got rejected by all 5. The reasons varied, and I don't know the weight of the reasons. But one, who the hell is Ted Aldrich was a question they said. You're not an author, you're not an academic, you're not famous. 2, those are pretty esoteric Americans you're writing about. 3, it's too long. 4, there have just been a few biographies of Marshall published. So then I went the academic route, and I had a few universities, Oxford University interested in Kentucky. I went through that process, which is very diligent. They send it to 2 or 3 historians, and they take 6 months looking at it. I was very frustrated. I had about 30 or 40 rejections, and I sent an email to, I looked on the internet who publishes military history and found Stackpole Books, part of Rowman and Littlefield. And I sent the guy an email, and it was kind of the email of someone who'd been defeated a lot. I said, listen, I'm not an academic. I'm not a historian. I'm a banker who wrote a book on these two guys. If that's a problem, you don't need to read anything more. But if it's not a problem, here's what I've written about. And most publishers take 4 to 6 weeks to come back to you, if they come back to you at all. He came back 3 days later, and I had just had one of my COVID shots, and I had a fever of like 102, and get an email saying, here's your contract. What? I couldn't believe it. So he just loved the idea, took a big leap of faith, and very, very thankful for Stackpole Books.
I hate to personalize this again, but believe it or not, Esther Newberg lived in the same building that Forrest Pogue and I lived in years and years and years ago.
Really?
And I do not know her, but
yeah,
I knew who she was. Let's go back to George Marshall, and I have the list here of all the things he did. He was the third Secretary of Defense because they changed the name of it, and it was September 51. He was the president of the Red Cross. He was the Secretary of State for 2 years during the Truman administration, Special China Envoy, Chief of Staff of the Army for 6 years. Tell us more about why everybody thinks he was so great.
Well, it starts early. He first of all, when he was at the Virginia Military Institute, much like George Washington, he kind of made his personality, he almost crafted his personality. He realized his goal was to be the top cadet, if you will. So he realized early on that you can't be friends or be close with people if you want to be men, if you want to lead them. So he's very reserved, very distant, and I think the average amount of demerits for a cadet at the Virginia Military Institute was like 100 a year. He had 0 over 4 years. So it wasn't even close. When he joined the Army, he quickly became known as the best student. He finished number 1 at various war colleges, and then the best teacher. Then he became the best staff person. His record was excellent, and it's worth telling a story how he got on the radar of Pershing. It was World War I, and Marshall was with the 1st Division, and they were giving exercises before Americans had fought any battles, and Pershing witnessed it one day. So as the general, Siebert, I think was his name, who was in charge of it, and he had 5 staff, including Marshall. And after the exercises were over, they gathered in a semicircle around Pershing to get feedback, and Pershing just lit into them. Just said, you guys are a disgrace. Turning to the general, you're a bum. I don't know how we're going to win the war with people like yourselves. You guys, I don't know what you've been doing. And he was going on and on. And the general in charge and 4 of the other staff were just kind of staring at their shoes. And after a couple of minutes, Marshall just said, General Pershing, you're being completely unfair. And Pershing glared at him and said something and started to walk off. And Marshall grabbed his arm and said, General, I've been here the longest. You need to hear what I have to say. And for the next 5 minutes, and what Marshall later said was an very inspired 5 minutes, he told him of all the shortages the 1st Division had, the problems they were having, how they were solving them before they went to bed each night. What he was saying, in effect, was, instead of criticizing, you should be thanking us and appreciating us. Marshall was still hot under the collar. He kind of grunted and stormed off. As he was leaving, the general and the other 5 guys turned to Marshall like, what were you thinking? And, they were wishing him well. They assumed he was going to be sent home. Marshall, on the other hand, Pershing, on the other hand, as he was walking off, he turned to his aide and said, whenever we're in communication with the 1st Division, I want it to be through that kid. So he got on the map, and then Pershing recruited him to his staff and then made him his aide de camp after the war. It's a curse being considered a great staff person, because you only get promoted in the Army and Air Force when you are in command of men, whether it's peace or war. But every general with clout could grab Marshall and put him on his staff, no matter how much Marshall fought. So he wasn't getting promoted. Douglas MacArthur started in the Army a year after Marshall. He got promoted to general 16 years before, because I think his personality, no one wanted him on his staff. So he was always put in charge of men. So it was those excellent qualities he had on top of his integrity and his sense of duty. And it's worth telling a story about duty. During World War One, he was asked to provide a logistics exercise. Before the very last offensive, Pershing had negotiated with Marshal Foch of the French to fight another battle. And Foch said, okay, but once you're finished, you have to be back at the front line within 10 days. And that was 60 miles away. Pershing put Marshall in charge. It was 400,000 troops, 100,000 mules and horses, 3,000 guns, 40,000 tons of equipment. He moved him on roads that were where there was troops going both ways. He pulled it off in 9 days, became known as a wizard. It was such a phenomenal feat that there was a guy on Pershing's staff named Dwight Morrow, who later on became the father-in-law of Charles Lindbergh. He was a number 2 or 3 guy at J.P. Morgan. And he immediately, after the war, offered Marshall a job at J.P. Morgan earning $30,000 a year. This is in 1918. To give you a sense of that money, Stimson, one of the high-priced lawyers in New York, was only making $20,000 a year. Marshall turned it down because he believed he owed the U.S. Army for all they've given him. So it's a long answer to say that people sensed his duty and his competence and his abilities. And that always made generals want him working for them.
You mentioned earlier that you've given probably 50 talks about this book. I've seen a number of them on YouTube. And it leads to this question. What have you learned about public performance?
Public performance in speaking?
What have you learned about having to tell the same story 50 times in front of an audience that you didn't expect to learn?
Well, I learned that people are really interested in hearing about things they hadn't heard before. At least the people that come to these talks. Of course, I learned what others have learned. People like to learn history through stories, as opposed to just facts and figures. So I try to sprinkle a combination of them. There are some wonderful stories about these guys. And if you permit me to tell one more story, as you mentioned, Marshall's career after the war ended. This is a story about his sense of duty. And I have similar stories about Stimson. He wanted to retire. He just wanted to retire. He told Truman, I want to retire. And Truman kept him on for a while. And he and his second wife, his first wife died of a heart attack, hadn't spent any time with each other as a married couple. And they had all these plans of what they were going to do in their retirement. And he had a very modest retirement ceremony, drove off to his house in Leesburg, Virginia. They were looking forward to the rest of their lives. And his wife went up to take a nap. And Truman calls him on the phone the day he retired and said, General, and he said, yes, Mr. President, I want you to go to China. And Marshall didn't want to wake up his wife, so he just said, okay. His wife came down the stairs about an hour and a half later, and it was top of the hour and the news was on. And she heard the following. She's halfway down the stairs. And in other news, President Truman named George Marshall to head a delegation to China. It leaves tomorrow. Now, I always think that she must have thought to herself, how long have I been asleep? The point is that he served another 7 years after that. And Robert Lovett, who was very close to him and served under him during the war, said he knows for a fact that he didn't want any of those assignments. He wanted to retire. That was his sense of duty. And people sensed that.
Your book is endorsed by, among others, Evan Thomas. And we just did a conversation about the wise men with him. How did you get to know Evan Thomas, and what impact did he have on how you did this book?
So Evan Thomas and Walter Isaacson, who also blurbed the book, wrote The Wise Men, and I read it about 20 years ago, and I loved it. I love learning about, figures who aren't given their credit, and a lot of those figures who worked for Stimson, John McCloy, Lovett, Harriman, etc. It was just a great book. So it helped inspire to write this one. I wrote Evan Thomas a letter out of the blue. I knew that to publish, it would help if I went to a publisher and said, I already have some blurbs. And reaching out to historians is not like reaching out to celebrities or rock stars. They respond to you. For example, Isaacson, I sent an email to. He wrote back 3 minutes later. basically saying, here's a blurb. I'll do a blurb for you. But so I didn't have Thomas's email address, so I sent him a letter to his home in Washington that I found on the internet. And I'll never forget this because he was the first one I really had contact with. It was a Sunday, and I get a phone call, and it was Evan Thomas. And I've read every one of Evan Thomas books, and I love the guy. And she's like, this is Evan Thomas. I'm like, Evan Thomas. So it turns out he was writing a book on Stimson and the decision to drop the bomb, which just came out, No Surrender. It's about Stimson and Ira Eaker, a U.S. Air Force guy, and a Japanese guy named Togo, who was defense minister, all about the end of the war and the decision to drop the bomb. So in my letter, he said, I'd love to hear your thoughts on that. So we spoke for like an hour and a half. And then after that, he just basically said, if you have any questions about anything. So he just helped mentor me through the process, explaining that it was going to take a while, explaining I needed to cut the book, explaining, here's a funny story. When I got the contract that I mentioned, I called Evan the next day and I said, I got this contract, tell me what I need to focus on. And he said, Ted, have you ever rented a car? I'm like, yes. He said, have you ever negotiated the rental car agreement? I'm like, no. He goes, just sign the thing. So he was very helpful in the whole process.
By the way, before I forget to ask this, are you going to write another book?
I definitely will. I'm still working and I don't have a subject, but I definitely see it in my future.
So we haven't talked a lot about what Stimson and what Marshall did, precisely what they did. That's why you have a book here that people can read. But I must ask you, if you take these two men, for each of them, what was the biggest impact they had? What would not have happened during the war if they hadn't been there?
Well, I'll start by giving a generalization. Someone in the War Department, I can't remember who it was describing Stimson. And his quote was, and I think it's in the book, like, it's hard for me to explain exactly what he did, but I can tell you this. Everyone within the War Department either did things or did not do things because Stimson was at the head of it. So he had this, everyone revered him. No one wanted to let him go, to let him down, which is the sign of a good leader. His staff was remarkable. But the specific things, I would say that because of their stature, because of their working together, they really initially helped prepare America for war. And that includes everything from drafting soldiers to keeping them in the service, which was a really dicey thing. The initial draft, they only had to serve a year, and a year later, it came down to one vote in Congress whether to renew it. And it was largely the efforts of Stimson and Marshall operating together and as a tag team, convincing senators who came from parts of the country where isolationism still ruled, and they wanted to stay in power, convincing them that the right thing to do is to keep these men in uniform. And after that, it was just all the high level things that were required to get things done. I mean, obviously, given they were managers, they couldn't do everything on their own, but they had remarkable staffs. Stimson's staff was considered the best in Washington, and I argue the best staff any cabinet member ever had. He had 5 core staff, all 5 Harvard Law School graduates, and with remarkable careers, McCloy and Lovett and George Harrison and Harvey Bundy and Robert Patterson as Undersecretary of War. So it was everything, and it's one of the reasons I wrote the book. We talk about the Eisenhowers and Pattons, but who supplied them the men? Who trained the men? Who trained them themselves? Who got them all the equipment at the right time, at the right place? Who gave them the strategy to fight the war? These guys were responsible for all that. So they were doing so much, it's hard to answer the question about anything specific.
What was Stimson's family like? Did he have children? And the same thing with Marshall.
Neither men had children. I think Stimson had childhood disease. I can't remember what it was.
Mumps. I think you said mumps.
Yeah, mumps. And that was it was speculation that was the reason. Marshall married someone who he met while he's at Virginia Military Academy. fell in love with her, but she had heart conditions, and their marriage didn't last that long because she died very young. And then he married a widow with 3 children. I think she was of childbearing age, but they never had children. And it's one of the reasons that they were very effective, because they were very paternalistic towards their staffs. Stimson, for example, long before it became fashionable, was really into the work hard, play hard offsites. He'd bring people out to his 100-acre estate in Long Island to play sports and intellectual games, and of course talk about the business at hand. So they were very good managers in that respect, but they were childless.
You write about the tension that was created by obviously being in the middle of the war, and the tension inside the bodies of these 2 men. What impact did tension have, stress have on them, and how healthy were they?
Well, again, they were way ahead of their times in terms of how they treated their bodies. We read articles about these kings of Wall Street who get by on 3 hours of sleep. That wasn't these guys. They both exercised every day. Stimson played this game called deck tennis almost every night at his estate in Washington. And he also rode horses, and Marshall rode a horse every day. And for Pearl Harbor conspiracy theorists, they know that he went out for a horse ride that morning for 45 minutes, and it was a critical 45 minutes. He was away from the action, where maybe if he was there, it would have helped. He would have read the 14th point of the 14-point memo from the Japanese and be able to give a better warning. They were encouraging their people to rest and exercise, and they wouldn't make decisions. Marshall would make a decision after 3 p.m. They weren't big socializers. They went home and they went to bed early. They left the office at reasonable hours, unlike Stanton during the Civil War and spent 18-hour, 19-hour days. These guys would leave the office around 5 because they just wanted to be sharp. And they were very healthy until the end of the war. What I haven't mentioned so far, but of course you know that Stimson was 78 years old when the war ended. And 78 back in 1945 might have been the equivalent of 85 today or older. And he had a heart attack the day Nagasaki was bombed with a second atomic bomb. And he had a major heart attack shortly thereafter, and kind of his last 5 years were spent in very declining health in Long Island. But they were healthy during the war. But I could sense from the diary that Stimson started to age in the last year. His writing wasn't as sharp. He was more tired. He complained in his diary all the time of being exhausted. But his style was to put everything into it, so it was hard for him to even relax his mind.
How wealthy was Stimson at the end of his life, and how wealthy was Marshall?
Let's start with Marshall, not too wealthy at all. I don't know what his net worth was, but he refused to do his memoirs. He was offered a ton of money for that. And he refused. He was of such high integrity, they never took any money. So my guess is he did not have a lot of money. Stimson was really wealthy. He was a lawyer who made a lot of money, but what really changed for him was he had a first cousin, who was pretty well known. I read about the book, whose name is escaping me right now, but there's a whole book on him. He was a Wall Street guy, a remarkable guy, a scientist, helped run the radar program. I'll come up with his name in a second. But he was someone, his first cousin made a fortune because he knew the stock market was going to crash in 29, and he pulled out, and he almost put it all back in just when it hit the bottom. And he managed Stimson's money, and it was at that point that Stimson became uber wealthy, because his cousin put all his assets in the stock market when it hit its low, which was, I don't know what the year was, sometime in the early 30s. So he was, I don't know what his wealth was, but he gave, he didn't have any children. He gave a lot to Phillips of Andover. There's a Washington private school called the Merit School. And that's where his home was, Woodley Mansion, which is, I think, built in 1814. He gave that to Phillips of Andover, who sold it to the Merit School. So don't have exact figures, but very wealthy man. And Marshall, not a very wealthy man at all.
Well, because you're involved in money and financing commodities and things like that. You're around a lot of wealth. Certainly, Rowayton is not a poverty area.
No.
And I'm leading up to a discussion you have in your book because I wanted you to philosophize on it. You're talking about, I suspect, Stimson in this case. We're talking about the charitable tradition of Christianity versus driven by accumulation of wealth. I'm reading from my notes. And that people who've made a lot of money desperately wanted to be involved with important things. Talk about that, because we see a lot of that. You name them today in our society, people who have made a lot of money. They want to be involved in important things. And why do they think government is more important than making money like they've been doing?
Well, it's interesting, yes. And it's you have to give the benefit of the doubt to some people, but a lot of people who've made a lot of money and go into government, it's because they want to become famous, or they want to become important, or they want power. With Stimson, it wasn't that. And this is reading the various biographies on some of the papers that I did look at. He, from a very early age, two things. He wanted to give back. And when he was a young lawyer, he started by going to people's apartments and talking to them, giving a little money. He was incredibly charitable towards the time that he had. He used in charitable means. And he also wanted to be involved in important things. But it wasn't because he wanted fame. He was never a guy that really sought that. And you can tell by his actions. He just enjoyed being involved in important things. And initially, it was important law cases. But he got bored of the law pretty soon. And he was spending a lot more time on his charitable things. And then Teddy Roosevelt really made the, quote, wise man that he became by giving him that first very important assignment. And once he did that, he wanted more of that. He was doing very important things in fighting monopolies and various trusts who were taking advantage of Americans. And after that, he said, I want to spend the rest of my life doing this. That is from Stimson's standpoint. I think you're referring to Stimson.
We've read a lot about people connecting skull and bones to people that went to Yale or Harvard. I don't know anything about skull and bones except this, and this is a quote from your book, that it's an organization that strongly pushed its members to contribute to society. I've never seen that before. Tell us what else you know about Skull and Bones, because so many people have been a member of that come to this town.
I mean, it's pretty elite, but I think what I learned outside of the charitable thing, and for Stimson particularly, was it really encouraged boys or men of those days, young men of those days, to be completely candid with each other and to have very close and intimate relationships. And that's what really drew him even more. And Stimson was reserved himself, came from a long line of reserved people. His father was very reserved, and his grandfather was very reserved. So all the way back. And he used his experience at Skull and Bones to attempt to have that kind of relationship with his father. He wanted to break that long line of Stimson reservedness and be very intimate and very open and very vulnerable. It didn't work with his father. But it was a big attractive part of Skull and Bones, and he kept those friendships for years. Don't get me wrong, it is also a very elitist organization. When you look at Stimson's staff, and during my presentations, you might have seen him if you looked at YouTube. I have one of his his 5 core staff with Stimson in the middle. They're all 3 of the 5 are Yale undergrad, and 5 of the 5 are Harvard Law. So you think, all right, he's just an elitist hiring from an old boys network. As it turns out, all those guys were remarkable, so it was more than that. There were plenty of people from the Harvard and Yale network that he didn't hire because character was huge, and he recognized that in the guys that he hired, who all had tremendous character, particularly Robert Patterson.
This is not an attempt to get you in the middle of partisan politics, but how would you rate the people that are in government today in these high positions? As we sit in a world that is very nuclear afraid, what's their quality today? Did any of them compete with these men that you write about in the past?
You know, My wife asks me a lot of questions about current events and is always a little frustrated when I don't have great answers. And I always tell her, look, I could tell you about, what was going on during the administration of Woodford B. Hayes, but I'm a little less comfortable talking about what's going on in the Biden administration. I would say that there are people like this, but keep in mind that neither Stimson or Marshall was a politician, right? And when you don't have to get votes, you're more able to do things out of principle, based on principle. That doesn't mean people won't still suck up to those people who are having the votes, presidents and the like. But I don't know. I'm asked this question a lot, and I always like to think that if I can't identify them now, if the country was in a real crisis, they would emerge. I do think they would emerge. But it's hard to compare a president who has to, in this era, where you need to appeal to your base to stay in power. And Roosevelt, for that example, Roosevelt doesn't come, he was a great man, but he doesn't come across as quite as great as these two men because he did have to hide the fact that he was an interventionist to stay in power. So at the time, people might have judged him a little wrongly, but in retrospect, it was the right thing to do because he probably was in a better position to lead the country through this crisis.
Wind it down, but I still need to ask you a couple of questions very quickly. I tried to find the diary of Henry Stimson online, and I couldn't. How do you get it if you want to read it?
Well, how you get it is you send me your email address, or your mailing address, and I'll send you a thumb drive. You can read all 10 volumes. I'm not going to do that for the general public. But I suppose you can go to Yale University and they will advise you. Maybe it's online now where you can buy them, the microfilm. You can only buy their microfilm. And then you can find online a company that converts microfilm to digital, as I did. But for you personally, if you're interested in reading them, it is fun. It is fun. It's long. The war, 4,000 pages, but I'd be happy to send you a thumb drive. Or I don't need it. I can email them to you.
On the other side, the Marshall books by Pogue, are they available?
Yes, they are. Amazon used books. They have them all. They're great books. Recommended for anyone who wants to do a deep dive on Marshall. There's some very good one-volume books. David Rohl, who was another mentor of mine, wrote one a few years ago. But to really do a deep dive, the 5-volume one it still stands the test of time.
Okay, last question. There is a Marshall Foundation based out here in the suburbs of Washington, and there is a Stimson Foundation. Do you know anything about them, and do they reflect, from what you know, these two men?
Well, the Marshall Foundation's in Lexington, right? And that's where his library, that's where his papers are, I believe.
I'm thinking of the house that's here, the Marshall House that's out in the suburbs.
Oh, that Leesburg, yeah, that's more a house, and of course it reflects him. He lived there; it was his passion. The Stimson, it's the Stimson Center is a think tank. I actually spoke there with Evan Thomas about Stimson, and very much that's why they named it after him because they believe that the big thing about Stimson was anti-isolationist. He said, forgetting about today, meaning in the 30s and 40s. That the world's connected. He would say the world's been connected for 1,000 years. We cannot let Hitler take over half the world, or it will be very much against your interests. So the Stimson Center, I think it's called, is very much into engaging with the world, and that is very consistent with Stimsonian thought, which was carried, by the way, from Stimson to his proteges. Through the Vietnam War, not always to a positive, and still exists today, the concept of being engaged in the world. And that's very much Stimson.
Thank you, Edward Farley Aldrich, better known as Ted. The book is The Partnership, George Marshall, Henry Stimson, and the Extraordinary Collaboration That Won World War II.
Brian, it's been my pleasure. Thank you very much.
Thanks for tuning into this week's Booknotes Plus podcast. If you have a moment, please consider rating and reviewing us wherever you listen to podcasts. Your feedback will help others discover the program. And don't forget to share this episode with friends and family. For the latest on new episodes, schedule updates, and more, follow us on X @C-SPAN Radio.